Kratos knows how to make an entrance. Almost 4 years since God of War was given a new lease of life within Norse mythology, now it's bringing new life to PC after Sony decided to dip its toes into the market. Fresh from first and third party exclusives in Horizon Zero Dawn, Days Gone and Death Stranding, we now have a true giant of the console space and his little boy. God of War was and remains one of my personal favourites of the entire PS4 generation. Although a 2018 release, it still holds up well in all aspects, from a compelling, witty and touching character-driven story.
Hello, Freya. Been a long time. You look well.
What I did for them. As far as I'm concerned, death suits you better.
I'd bow if I could, Your Majesty.
Some incredible set pieces, impactful and rousing music, topped off with a deep, skill-based and above all rewarding combat system. It delivers on all aspects, as the visuals were impeccable at the time and certainly the hardware, and it still looks great today. A stylistic design is used throughout, from skin tones, colour mapping, rugged noisy textures, materials, light, volume and art. It all works though, and it really delivers some stunning vistas, enemy designs and embraces that Nordic fantasy world very well. And it keeps that huge scale that has always been a big part of the God of War titles from beginning to end. Here, it loses none of that and its visceral action. This new PC release, however, has not been helmed by PlayStation's largest studio acquisition, well, before I made this video anyway, in PC porting specialist of Nixxes. With such a strong and embellished legacy, it shows that Sony are taking the PC market very seriously indeed. With the target project for this God of War port likely agreed and active long before any ink was even spilt, let alone dry, on that particular Nixxes deal. Instead, a Canadian Jetpack Interactive picked this up, and this is predominantly program focused port of that PS4 and Pro hit over to the PC within a DirectX 11 renderer. How good is it though, and what boosts do we get then? Well, you may have already seen my IGN coverage, and that does cover the game at a high level, but here I wanted to go more specifically around the areas I touched at. And the first big point of discussion here is, why did they use DirectX 11? Well, this has some ramifications in performance and hardware utilization. The main reason, I believe, is because the PS4 title would have used GNM, and thus the Sony HSL version PSSL, so high level shader language or PlayStation shader language. Now, as part of the core SDK at the time, circa 2015-2018, this will make sense. As such, this will map well back to DX11, as GNM already follows similar functions, and indeed the wrapper GNMX is used to ease PC ports to PS4, which includes DirectX 11. Fundamentally, PSSL can be converted via compilation into a GLSL, so OpenGL shader language, which itself is easily supported in DirectX and maps back to HLSL within the DirectX rendering pipeline. Now, this does not mean identical, but much less involved than a source rewrite. I'm sure many elements of the async GPU jobs would have needed updates and changes, and indeed the fact DX11 is used would have hindered that area. As DirectX 11 is a heavily serialized API, single-threaded rendering, heavy state control, higher driver cost, etc., which does benefit Nvidia over AMD, as Nvidia have long since had a better, more efficient DirectX 11 driver implementation. Remember, in the PC space there's a lot of cross APIs and that configuration control that hinders a lot of developers, and it also means you're at the whims of the driver quality of your particular GPU, in this case AMD and Nvidia. And for DirectX 11, there's no doubt, I've always stated this, Nvidia is better. Now, this is all borne out by the utilization on my RTX card being much higher and also less taxing on the CPU than on my far more powerful RX 6800 in many areas. Now, not all of this is down to the DirectX 11 GPU driver, but as I have covered many times, the design of these consoles and unified memory across CPU and GPU means that the expensive memory allocation, caching and combined writes, reads and all of these aspects will become far slower and require some big changes. The engine likely relies heavily on shared jobs between GPU and CPU, which will be hidden within asynchronous work with much lower latency costs and less mem copy or such actions, which heavily affect the PC. To keep things simple, the PC cost of managing these two pools of RAM and any code that is shared between them can and will have big performance impacts on keeping the GPU and CPU fed. The net result is we can see both GPUs becoming CPU and or memory bound at times due to many of these areas. This does not impact the RTX card anywhere near as bad as the AMD one, as the driver implementation and management of these areas is more efficient, but it still affects it. In a perfect example here, both cards are at the identical settings and resolution, but the almost 2 times more powerful AMD card is actually slightly slower than the RTX one, even with faster CPU and system memory. The RX 6800 is simply waiting on work. As you can see from the command queue, is sub 80% all of the time, and the clocks are idling to half or less of the limits, cemented by the power usage dropping very low. This means that in the game, due to the very tightly managed culling of geometry within the frustum of the engine, the frame rate can drastically peak and trough as you move around the world and the camera, and it affects the AMD card far more, and it means the best way to utilize the card is to just run the game at 4K. As you can see in sections like this, performance remains identical going from 4K to 1440p and even lower resolutions, with only the GPU power and resources dropping down as you go. Now I can hear the comments below. You idiot! Horizon Zero Dawn is older and that was a DirectX 12 renderer. You know nothing. However, you are missing some vital parts. Software development has many targets and restrictions, and these have to be factored within the delivery schedule. You see, the big benefits of DirectX 11 is you do not have mass shader compilations required during runtime, either pre-compiled into bytecode or dynamically created in the game, alongside the shader cache required for different GPUs or even when new drivers are installed, which we saw cause issues in the Horizon Zero Dawn port, which I covered early in its launch, something which has been significantly improved, if not removed, with the support of Nixes themselves. Turning this into an async compilation now, getting in early on the workload ahead, and I'm sure DirectX 12 will return as a de facto renderer moving forward. Simply put, the pros outweighed the cons for this port and ensured a more consistent game across the market with a shorter critical path to delivery. Does this make it a bad port then? Well, no. It means the work involved would have been significant and likely pushing the PC port out sometime into next year, which misses the critical reason for it, to entice people into the new Ragnarok landing this year on PS5 and PS4. As such, this rarely impacts the game in combat or exploration sections, but as we have seen with the introduction of DX12, DX11 as a whole can underutilize hardware when complex rendering and GPU jobs are utilized. I also covered this briefly in my Dying Light 2 review over on IGN, which can see a 30% increase in performance like for like on AMD cards going from DX11 to DX12. Not everything in the engine or ports are at fault by the developers themselves, and I hope this detailed discussion helps clarify some of the issues here and across other titles you may see, hear, or experience yourself.
Why is he doing that?
Odin had that statue made in honor of Thor, and seeing as the world's serpent absolutely abhors the fat dauber.
Next area to cover is image quality boost and stability. The PS4 ran at 1080p, the Pro via checkerboarding, meaning 1920 by 2160. This temporarily interpolated each frame across 2 to make 3840 by 2160. The PC can go all the way up to big boy 3840 by 2160 if you have the hardware, but comparing the three main sets here, then the boost to texture clarity and sharpness can obviously be noticed, so long as we are in these comparison shots though, in these slow, stationary and zoomed in elements. But the cost is huge, and once in any type of motion, even as I slow down and pause here, then the motion blur and motion of camera and object mean the difference is now gone. All of this means the closer to the camera you are, the less important the resolution is, and the further away, obviously, the more important it is. But I'm happy to report that it also supports reconstruction techniques of its own. Now the PC space has followed suit with consoles. We now get DLSS being a proprietary solution for Nvidia that utilizes the tensor cores found in their cards, meaning if you have to have an RTX card to deliver this option. You can now power this up to 4K on weaker or cheaper cards, or even cards you can actually get hold of, let's be honest. AMD's FSR is also included, which is a spatial upscale and post-contrast aware sharpening filter. It offers great results here, and with this sharpening filter can also deliver excellent payback in that performance versus IQ war. But which is the best then? Well, on a pure technology and final results perspective, DLSS is, but the gap is not consistent, and the performance delta is also a factor. In like-for-like settings of performance, quality, etc., FSR is more performant than DLSS. Now, I'm testing all of this on the exact same GPU, in this case the RTX 2070 overclocked, and it's the only card that can run both FSR and DLSS here. FSR is open source, so you can run it on any GPU, even older ones such as the 5600 or the RX 580, but DLSS can only be run on the RTX 2000 and 3000 series of cards. Starting at the bottom, we have DLSS Ultra Performance, which renders from a native 1280 by 720p base to target 4K, and as you would expect, results wouldn't convince anybody at all. In most aspects, it can actually be better than 1080p on PS4, although this is a mixture of that 4K upscale from the output and that sharpening pass within DLSS itself. Can really help performance as you would expect, but the incredibly low output buffers cause severe shimmer, flickering and frequency aliasing on shadow maps, alpha textures such as Kratos' beard, post effects and overall image quality that I simply would never use it as the cost to IQ is far too high. Next up we have performance, the same on both DLSS and FSR, targeting 1080p, which now starts to resolve a cleaner image back up to 4K on both DLSS, with FSR not being so successful again, showing more noise on alpha effects and any post effects on top, plus that shimmering, stretchy, blurry movement on textures when that sharpening filter breaks down. It's decent enough if you need to hit solid frame rates, but for me, both still look sufficiently sub 4K to never convince you, although the trade-off here is getting very small. Balance does offer the best, well, balance really, 2260 by 1272 for FSR and 2228 by 1254 for DLSS. As close as the target buffers are though, this is now where the IQ impact on both is close enough to not cause a huge concern. Certainly DLSS is better and resolves more detail with a higher level of stability, with textured details certainly being sharper, but at standard viewing distances in motion it can be harder to notice, and the performance difference between them is in FSR's favour, unsurprisingly. The final choice for DLSS players is the best one, quality, which targets 2560 by 1440 on both FSR and DLSS, but again the DLSS solution wins out on fine details and stability of the entire image, coming close to the 4K option most of the time to not really be noticed outside of zooming in and checking it. FSR is softer, alpha transparencies and high frequency elements of textures are slightly less refined, but again in action this is almost impossible to spot, and the uplift to performance can again be around 9 to 10% better on average, which can be the difference between a locked 60 in combat and a sub 60 FPS. FSR has one more setting though, Ultra Quality, that goes above DLSS to 2954 by 1662. All of these can be seen clearly in the menu. And this is approximately 77% of 4K, and at this level you get practically identical IQ and performance levels to DLSS at quality. It can be around 3 to 5% slower at worst than DLSS quality, but if IQ is your preference and you do not have a DLSS capable card, it is an excellent way to claw back around 25% performance from 4K that can easily pass for 4K almost all the time. What about that checkerboard solution then? Well, the Pro to PS5 looks a mirror aside gamma output changes on each and the temporal increase to 60 FPS the PS5 offers. Remember, this is exactly the same code as the PS4 Pro. Here I'm using the disc version, the day one disc version, which allows it to run at 60 FPS. This is exactly what you're seeing on screen. It's not even the downloaded version, which just reverted to this. Now, aside these areas where zooming in and looking at these sections, it still does a great job of looking like 4K, coming somewhere between performance and quality on DLSS and FSR. Texture sharpness is one area, but a sharpening pass would likely resolve much of this, and dithering is more pronounced on alpha and edges in motion. Aside this though, and at this level, you can notice it, but we always need to keep in mind that games are played not at zoomed in 300% and slowed down to 25%. Overall, comparing the two here between the FSR Ultra quality version on the PC and then DLSS quality on the PC as well against that checkerboarded 4K option, checkerboarding is still a great solution, and the sharpness and clarity from it were and are a great boost to the IQ, even over that base PS4 version. From IQ alone, then DLSS quality or FSR Ultra quality are pretty much identical to almost all players, unless you sit 2 feet from a 4K screen, but even then you're probably going to need a side-by-side to tell. But in performance stakes alone, then DLSS quality wins by a couple of percentage. FSR quality wins the best balance, as in play the IQ is not significantly impacted to cause any great offence, but the performance gain is around 10 to 12% on the exact same RTX hardware, and that's more noticeable overall than the IQ slight increase you get from DLSS quality. That's my preferred bang for buck for your hardware. Now, if you only have an AMD card, then pick the one that gets you to my optimized settings at the end of this video that balance that performance and visual boost over the PS4 and Pro versions. If you do have a DLSS quality card, then anything from, say, balance to quality is going to fit you right, and you probably pick balance because you do get a slight increase in performance, anywhere between, I don't know, somewhere around 5 to 6 FPS in this title, so potentially 14%, which is worth it if you need that to get to 60 FPS.
I can enhance it for you right now if it so pleases you, son of a bitch. So what say you? Ah!
You are right. I do not believe you. Come, boy.
There's a rune in the shape of a fork under the grip. No, digger bisha dumber bakwa. That was our brand, my brother and me, before we split. I got half of it right here, see? Look, you want I should upgrade her or not?
One minor caveat is that checkerboarding can obviously affect things like post effects, alpha effects, such as SSR reflections here on the screen, which you can see drop off when checkerboard is activated. This doesn't affect the PS4 Pro at native 1080. It's a checkerboard solution because of the fact that it reconstructs the image. It can affect things like post-processing. But over and above this, PC can push the visual quality better than PS4 Pro. Volumetrics is a good example where they can bump up over the PS4 and the Pro, giving a much sharper, higher resolution density of that fog volume, and obviously it means it casts in front of geometry and doesn't have as much dithering and doesn't stand out quite as much. And there's also more of them, they're much denser in certain areas when they crop up, and this obviously matches up to the original settings on the PC, which is the same as the PS4 Pro and obviously the PS5 here. Again, LOD is improved, you get much denser foliage, objects drawn much further out in the frustum, so they have higher quality LOD, and obviously the light and shadow is a big improvement. Look at Kratos' head there and across his chest. The additional resolution on the shadow maps, the better AO, and overall just more shadow maps being cast across every scene just gives you much better grounding of objects within the scene and much more accurate lighting across characters, grounds, and other things in the game itself. Again, the impact on these can be reasonably high in certain areas, but it does significantly reduce some of the dithering and flickering that can happen when you get shadow maps close on character bodies and obviously very close in cinematics. Doesn't resolve it, but it does reduce it. Obviously there are some other minor improvements. Motion blur sample rate is better, alpha effects are better because of resolution, but generally that's it. There is a 50% impact even at FSR quality here, going from low to ultra, so be aware of the impact there. It's very, very high, but much of that is shadows. But if you do want to sneak back as much performance as you can, let's go through those areas. So anisotropic filtering is a good example. PC players think it's free. It's not. Here at 4K, you're getting 4% back. Doesn't sound like a lot. When you're making a game, it's about frame time, not frame rate. So if you're targeting 16 milliseconds, that 4% could be the difference between winning and losing that frame battle. On top of this, ultra shadows can be variable. So here they're only an 8% cost in this particular area. Again, more shadow maps, higher resolution. This is a good example here, not the torch from Kratos himself, that's a standard shadow map, but at the background that I'm highlighting the bushes, you can see going from ultra to high, that has an impact of around 10% in this particular scene, which pushes us over 100 FPS. Going from high to the PS4 Pro settings of original, that can give us a further 8% increase. So again, it is showing that they have an impact even in these quieter sections with minimal maps. Going from original to low only has around 5%. So again, it might add up, it might not be worth it, but overall, original is the minimum I would recommend. But other sections here, look in the background where you can see all that shadow into the distance, the light and shade. Watch as we go from ultra to high, all of that is removed and all the shadow maps are cooled much nearer in the frustum. But that gives you 30% increase, a monstrous increase, and shows you how expensive shadow maps are or can be. From high to original, it's not such a big increase, again around 10%, and that's largely down to the fact that it's just reducing the resolution and the dithering on the edges. Overall, these settings are welcome, and like I say, the AO and shadow are the biggest ones overall in the title itself, but you have to pick your battles. Here I'm comparing what high settings look like using the two options I mentioned before, which is FSR quality and DLSS quality. As you can see here, even in action, there's certainly a sharper image quality on that DLSS quality option, but overall performance is again around 12 to 15%, fluctuating back and forth between the two. It means that the DLSS option here on exactly the same hardware is dipping below 60 pretty much every few seconds or so, where it's not dipping below 60 on the FSR option, and that means it's the one to choose. In certain sections you can see the gaps go up and down. This is always the case when it comes to rendering. You're never going to get like for like examples all the time. There's that margin of error, which means on average, using these two options at high settings, you gain around 12%, which means it's definitely worth using FSR if performance is your key metric. Now, if you are going for visual payback, then you have to go to ultra settings, because you effectively need those shadow options to really gain the biggest boost in image quality over the IQ. And that means you then need to rely on something like DLSS balanced or FSR balanced. If you've got the choice, DLSS all day, every day on balanced. Even though the performance is slightly better on FSR, the impact to IQ is definitely lower. And as you can see here, it certainly does the job. The other thing to mention, and I mentioned this in detail in my Death Stranding PC analysis, so I'm not going to go over that again, but obviously VSync is a cost. It's a very expensive cost at times, because the whole engine has to regroup again at certain points and wait for whatever the slowest point is before it can restart the next frame, depending on how many frames you've staggered up in the background, and I'll get to input latency at the end. And that means that you really want to either use an external AMD or Nvidia frame rate limiter to 60, because the one in the game can have an expensive cost to the overall performance. As you can see, brief examples here. Irrespective of what RTSS is telling you on screen, the actual output to the screen means that it rendered the frame in time, but for whatever reason didn't flip it to the front buffer, so you don't see it. So it doesn't pick up the fact that it's dropping frames at certain points. You can see the spike on the CPU frame time graph there, but you're not seeing it present to the frame, or at least the screen. So here, capping at 120 FPS or turning VSync off, I'm capturing the footage at 60 FPS. So you can see RTSS is telling me it's going above 60, which is as I would expect, but the actual capture is capturing at 60. You can now see that those dips do happen very briefly, but they're nowhere near as bad, because performance on the GPU is always up the top end. So it's flipping things when it can, and it's dropping frames in the very brief moments when it can't. A lot of it seems to be fill rate limited here. But generally, you get better performance by using an AMD or an Nvidia external frame limiter than the in-game one, or turning VSync off, which I don't recommend because I hate tearing, or running at 120 FPS if you have a 120 FPS screen, and you get better performance because you're not hitting those peaks and troughs of that VSync issue which I've mentioned.
I think you got him.
So this fight is actually one of the most stressful in the title, because it's using all the effects, all the alpha in the background, big large character, very dense area to fight within, and that means it stresses all of the versions out. Here we can test in the PS4, the PS4 Pro at that checkerboard 30 FPS limit, and obviously the PS4 Pro's 60 FPS mode, which is 1080p, effectively the same as the PS4. This is patched up to the latest versions, and as you can see in this stressful section, we can get a few dips under 30 on the checkerboard solution, and it's certainly somewhere around that 50 level on the PS4 Pro in that 60 FPS mode. But again, this is, like I say, one of the most stressful sections I could find in the title to push this through. So you can definitely see that it really does stress every piece of hardware, and that's why I used it for the PC test as well. It's heavy, it uses lots of alpha effects and dense particle effects, and obviously lots of geometry in terms of the battle, so it makes sense that this is stressful on the GPU and even the CPU, because of all the AI characters fighting you. There's little annoying plebs that get in the way as you're trying to fight the troll. So using this as a test to go back to the PS5, again it's using exactly the same settings from the disc version. There's no update here, it's the same code as the Pro, but it's running at checkerboard 60 FPS and comparing it to as close as I can get on the RTX 2070. It's overclocked. You can see the specs of my PCs that I used here on the screen, and this means that I'm getting identical resolution throughputs and trying to keep them both capped at 60 to see what the performance looks like, and as you can see it generally holds it perfectly on the RTX 2070. But there are definitely points where it can dip lower, certainly at the end with all those heavy alpha effects where the Pro doesn't drop, the PS5 doesn't drop a frame. So you can definitely see the performance metric here, but obviously if it was uncapped you would see a bigger delta. I'm assuming this is obviously similar to what we saw with Death Stranding, maybe even slightly worse, because again there's no change to the engine code here, so probably somewhere between 30 to 40% benefit at certain points. In fact, I couldn't find a place in the PS5 version that drops a frame here. There is one section at a cutscene. Again, I don't show that cutscene because I think it's a big part of the game, but it's the one where you meet a certain big enemy in the title early on. That can have you drop into somewhere, a couple of frames here and there, 55 levels at worst. But overall, it's a locked 60, and most of the battles here, as you can see, it holds that performance well. So it's still performing better than an RTX 2070 Super, and I must stress this is running the exact same disk code, the day one disk code of the Pro, so there's no changes here. So it's effectively somewhere between a 3060 or 3070 at this particular title. So again, it's doing that without any additional benefits or utilizing the specific benefits of the RDNA architecture. Moving to the RX 6800, we obviously have a lot more to play with here. So using FSR quality mode at those ultra high settings, so everything maxed out, we are comfortably above 60 FPS in traversal and combat. As you can see here, it holds enough to lock it at 60 FPS, but it's still a very stressful title. Even on this particular card, 17 teraflops of power, you're seeing somewhere around 70 to 80 FPS in these performance modes. Now that does mean that you get good performance throughout, and you can cap it at these levels, or you can go slightly lower down the resolution stack and target 120. But like I've already covered, there are areas where it struggles, specifically on the AMD card, which I'll touch on at the end, the overall situation where it is with the team. But you are seeing performance that's probably lower than you probably would expect. So just be aware of that when you're setting it up. And obviously the lurching and stuttering that happens going between sections, all again around that memory allocation system, that again happens on every piece of hardware, no matter what you've got. The faster the CPU, the faster your RAM, then that will reduce that impact, obviously, but you won't remove it. It will still stutter. And that means you can be at 60 and drop below 60 when you're opening a door, or those standard sections the whole game is designed around. Even the fast travel is euphemistic here. It's you literally go to a door and then have to run through an area while it loads the next area where you're going to go to, and then you open the door that appears in front of you and move through. So all of that is still present in the engine, just really highlighting they can't rewrite the source code and change everything from scratch. The next big improvement is loading, and obviously it's faster on everything here, including the PS4 Pro. It's 60 versus 30, as you can see at the bottom, and at the top 60 versus 120 for PC. And that means that PC is faster than the PS5, even at 60 by a couple of seconds, but 120 it's faster still. It's actually nearly 50% slower at 60 FPS. And this again shows the cost of VSync, and by turning it off or running at the highest frame rate, you get better performance everywhere, and this includes loading. You can still see on the PS4 Pro it's actually faster than the PS5 in backwards compatibility. Even on an SSD internally, it's a much slower SSD than what's inside the PS5. The next part of performance is input latency, very important, and obviously the PS4 Pro at 30 FPS was a pretty heavy game, around 150 milliseconds of input times as a median. And then you go to the PS5 and using the 60 FPS mode, you're dropping that right down to a median of 88 milliseconds. Very impressive. It can be lower depending on things that you do, like moving the camera around. But obviously the PS4 Pro at 60 FPS is actually slightly faster than the PS5. That cost of backwards compatibility is there ever so slightly. Only around 6 to 7 milliseconds, but it's definitely visible. And you can see by going to the PC, just using the high settings at 60, it's still pretty high when the input time is affected by that. But once you go from 60 a locked and 120, it gets much, much lower, right down to 60 milliseconds as a median. And then you turn on those PC latency and PC latency plus options that Nvidia have specifically for their cards. So you can actually get close to 120 FPS frame times by using that mode at 60 FPS. That means it's a significant improvement over the standard 60 FPS mode, and shows that they just poll slightly later in the frame time to get the best bang for buck in terms of when you press the button or move the stick or even move the mouse and keyboard. It just gives you that little bit back on screen. Ultimately, I think I've covered every single aspect in this 30-minute deep dive into God of War PC release against all the other versions, how everything stacks up, and ultimately, again, reinforces my view as of my IGN review, which is it's an improved port over the PS4 Pro version that it really tried to improve on. The PS5 backwards compatibility mode, not so much. There is visual benefits there. There's certainly improvements there on the visual quality and overall performance above 60 FPS if you have the hardware, but there are those small areas of improvements they really need to fix, and they have said that, as just seen here. They've obviously found that issue around the AMD cards, and like I say, it's predominantly related to the driver issue. It's causing it to underutilize it excessively, but this means that they're going to have to go in and make more changes in their code to try and compensate for that, or maybe they're even working with AMD to try and improve the driver specifically around an update on this GPU. I don't know. It affects every single AMD card because of the DX11 side, so there's definitely something around that aspect as I've covered in depth, and obviously it nowhere near affects the Nvidia cards to this level. I love God of War. I finished it now. This must be the 5th time I've finished the game from beginning to end because I just love it so much. It's a great title. Cannot wait to play Ragnarok. And hopefully this video was useful and informative. And if it was, or anything else that I do, then please share, like, subscribe, all that good stuff. And obviously support me over on Patreon if you can, because that really helps me improve the quality here. And I'm moving towards using that more this year and getting more dedicated content on that and exclusive content so that people can see more and I can dive a little deeper into some of the areas that I don't tend to do on the channel here. Anyway, if you do like it, subscribe, share, and I'll catch you very soon either on here or over on IGN. I'll see you on the next one.